Well, what do you know? The Supreme Court has rejected yet another legal challenge to Obamacare. And once again, Chief Justice John Roberts played an important role in that rejection. Why am I not surprised? Well, of course, the answer to that rhetorical question is that, Justice Roberts in particular seems to have a preoccupation with the court's institutional legitimacy in the eyes of the American public. He seems determined to avoid the appearance that the court is simply legislating from the bench in a conservative direction, any more than it's legislating from the bench in a liberal direction, right? I think that was shown pretty plainly 3 years ago when Justice Roberts cooked up that taxing power rationalization to save the individual mandate of Obamacare from invalidation in the NFIB versus Sebelius case. But, I think there are a few lessons to be learned for opponents of the law, mainly Republicans, from this whole long, sad effort to get various parts of the law invalidated in court. First of all, let me say very quickly, I think that the case against Obamacare in this particular lawsuit actually did have merit. I'm not convinced by the Supreme Court's ruling in this case. I think that what happened is that the Democrats who put this law together back in 2009 and early 2010 did not anticipate so much resistance to the law at the state level. I don't think they anticipated that Republicans in a lot of state legislatures and governors' mansions or in Congress would refuse to allow a lot of the states to go along with the law, both when it came to the insurance exchanges and the Medicaid expansion. And I think they didn't see all of these lawsuits against the healthcare law coming. So they wrote the law not taking those eventualities into account. They wrote a law that was based on the premise that the states would establish their own insurance exchanges. Frankly, and if you listen to the testimony of people, architects of the law like Jonathan Gruber, at the time, it seems pretty clear that that is what they had in mind. This whole idea that the federal government could ride to the rescue and establish its own exchanges in states that didn't do it themselves, that the feds could just pick up the slack, that really was a post and after the fact rationalization designed to save the law from being dismantled or from collapsing after a lot of this Republican opposition in the states came into being. So frankly, I don't agree with the Supreme Court's decision in this case. I don't think it's the role of the courts to ride to the rescue and save politicians bacon by cleaning up their messes. I don't think the courts should clean up after politicians. If they draft a law poorly or thoughtlessly or carelessly, then they should have to deal with the consequences of it. It should be up to the people's elected representatives to deal with the consequences of their own poor legislative drafting. I don't think it's the role of the courts to correct those mistakes for them, all for the sake of achieving a certain narrow policy result. However, there are larger lessons to be learned here for particularly Republicans and more generally for conservatives and libertarians who oppose this law root, stem, and branch. First of all, there have been times in the past when the Republicans ran the show in Washington when they controlled both houses of Congress and the White House, and they could have taken those opportunities, such as 10 years ago, for example, to implement a more free market-oriented form of healthcare reform. But they didn't. Some Republicans in Congress floated some ideas along those lines, introducing bills to reduce interstate barriers to competition in the health insurance market so as to enable greater competition and bring down health insurance costs, or allowing for tax-free health savings accounts, things of that nature. But for some reason, Republicans as a party, and of course the Bush administration, never really united around those proposals. They didn't put any effort or political capital into getting them passed through Congress. Well, guess what the effect of that was long term? It created a situation in which the Democrats could win back both houses of Congress, and then, Barack Obama could come along, win the White House, and get this kind of healthcare reform pushed through Congress. Well, guess what? Republicans had the opportunity to take healthcare reform in a different, more market-friendly, individual freedom-friendly direction, and they blew it. They dropped the ball. In fact, they never even picked up the ball in the first place. Now, I can understand why. Traditionally, Republican politicians and activists have felt that, people for whom healthcare reform is a priority tend to be Democrats and Democratic supporters, period. They tend not to support Republicans no matter what, and so Republicans understandably feared that even if they took up the mantle of healthcare reform, they wouldn't have anything to show for it politically. They wouldn't get any political credit for it. But at the end of the day, that attitude, the whole approach of neglecting healthcare reform simply because they didn't think they could make political hay out of it, ended up backfiring against Republicans and their sympathizers spectacularly. And this is the result. This is the consequence. Now, I think the second lesson to be learned from this is that whether it's Republicans or Democrats, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, whoever else, people who are, political activists and their politician allies cannot expect the courts to save the day and vindicate their causes in the unelected branch of government when they fail to get the job done in the elected branches. Now, let me make myself clear. I'm not saying that in cases where the government appears to be acting unconstitutionally or illegally, there shouldn't be legal challenges to it. By all means, file your lawsuits. Make the case against these laws in the courts if you think you can win. But always know that there's a chance you won't win. Even if you really ought to win, if your case has more merit than your opponent's case, than the government's case, on the merits and in the substance of the issue, there's always a chance that, judges who are abdicating their duty as judges will simply thwart your agenda. You can't expect, the unelected branch of government to, again, save your political bacon when you can't get the job done on your own. That's the bottom line. You can't rely on the courts to do the right thing or what you believe to be the right thing in these situations. At the end of the day, the best approach is to try to win elections and get your agenda enacted up front before your opponents can get into power and screw things up. Okay? Now Republicans, even after all these years of struggle against Obamacare, they're still trying to come up with some kind of viable alternative. And although the ideas are there, for some reason, the party has not yet been able to unite around a coherent, concrete alternative to Obamacare. That is the central failure of opponents of Obamacare in the political class up to this point. Well, here's my message for them. Get your act together. Otherwise, you're just going to have to get used to Obamacare, because with every passing day, week, and month, and year, more and more Americans come to rely on the law's provisions to get their health insurance. And I don't think you can blame them for doing that. So Republicans had better, they better pull their socks up and start coming up with and uniting around some concrete, meaningful alternative to Obamacare. Because I think the message the court has sent them in this case is, don't expect us to fight your political battles for you. Even if, in reality, objectively, the court should have ruled the other way in this case, bottom line is they didn't. And I think Justice Roberts made it clear, both in oral argument and in this opinion, that he is not going to, rescue Republicans from the consequences of their own political failures. So that's the message, and I think that's the lesson to be learned here. Opponents of the law, people who favor a more free market healthcare system, had better get cracking. And these Republican presidential candidates, this whole gang of fools that's assembled so far, with a few exceptions, they'd better get serious about it too. Otherwise, this law might very well be here to stay. You better recognize. Looking forward to the discussion, folks.